Hello there. This is Nathan Gilmore. I want to welcome my friends from Bogart Christian Church as well as those who have tuned in from other areas. This is Virtual Bible Study, and we're on to Isaiah chapters 13 and 14. We're going a couple chapters a week and talking about hopefully the whole book of Isaiah with the idea that we're going to see whether this Bible study or the pandemic lasts longer. If you're looking at this from the future, yes, that does mean that we're in late 2020. So let's talk a little bit about what's come before. The first 5 chapters of Isaiah, just to give you the big blocks, are a global vision of the future of the Jerusalem kingdom and the Samaria kingdom, the ones called Judah and Israel, or collectively called Israel. It gets a little bit confusing sometimes. But it's a vision of resurrection. They are going to, in the age to come, be a place where the nations will come for instruction to find their salvation. But before then, because they have become so much like every other empire, because they've become another Pharaoh, God is going to treat them the way that God already treated Pharaoh back in Exodus. God is going to smash them. And so the call goes out in those opening 5 chapters. Don't wait around and find out whether or not God means it. Don't trust in your own military might. Don't trust in your own power, but rather, actually, I do know, but rather live the life that God brought out of Egypt, namely the life of Torah, the life of righteousness, the life of justice. All right. The next 7 chapters, chapters 6 through 12, are the beginning of the narrative of Isaiah. Isaiah is an 8th century prophet. He has a vision of God in the Jerusalem temple, and then he has access to the king of Jerusalem, Ahaz, and brings Ahaz a message that the new alliance that has formed between Damascus and Samaria, yes, that's the northern kingdom coming down with Syrian allies, it's not going to destroy Jerusalem. There's going to be another power, a greater power, that's going to come and devour both of them. And then that power is going to come and lay siege to Jerusalem. It's going to surround Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is going to be functionally done, functionally dead. But God is going to deliver them in a way that will leave no doubt that it was God that did it. We're going to see that narrative a little bit farther along. Now, chapter 13 begins a new section of the book of Isaiah. Like I said, chapters 6 through 12 are Isaiah's story, and it returns to that idea of the vision of the renewed Jerusalem. This is where the famous images of the lion lying down with the lamb, the child playing over the asp's nest. This restoration of Jerusalem is going to be a total and a cosmic restoration of all of the world to righteousness. And we talked a little bit about how in the wake of Jesus, his incarnation and his ministry, his crucifixion and resurrection, Christians were pretty ready to interpret Isaiah as referring not to an age that Isaiah in his own lifetime would have seen come, but rather to an age that is coming beyond our own lifetimes, or could be coming beyond our lifetimes, namely an age to come that is ushered in by the anointed one, which Isaiah does talk about. But for Christians, of course, that anointed one, or that Messiah, or that Christ, is Jesus of Nazareth. All right. So that's what has come up to chapter 13. Let's go ahead and start into chapter 13. If you're with me through the book of Amos, you'll remember that, Amos spoke oracles not only against Samaria and not only against Jerusalem. And of course, Amos is roughly speaking a contemporary of Isaiah, 8th century BC, give or take. But he spoke oracles against other nations as well. Isaiah does that, and it is a much more extensive set of oracles against the other nations. Of course, Isaiah is the longest of the prophetic books in the Old Testament, so anything that Isaiah does, Isaiah is going to do big. So let's see what comes of it. Chapter 13, I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Verse 1. The oracle concerning Babylon that Isaiah son of Amoz saw. On a bare hill raise a signal, cry aloud to them, wave the hand for them to enter the gates of the nobles. I myself have commanded my consecrated ones, have summoned my warriors, my proudly exulting ones, to execute my anger. Listen, tumult on the mountains as of a great multitude. Listen, an uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathering together. The Lord of hosts is mustering an army for battle. They come from a distant land, from the end of the heavens. The Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole earth. So this is interesting because in the 8th century BC, there are rumblings that Babylon is starting to come back into some kind of power. But right now, Assyria, we talked in the last few lessons, is really the great threat, the great superpower. And of course, even beyond Assyria, the people of Jerusalem are worried neither about Nineveh, the Assyrian city, nor Babylon, the Babylonian city, but about Samaria and about Damascus, their more immediate neighbors. But here, God gives Isaiah a vision that stretches beyond the current power rankings, if you will, and goes ahead and prophesies that when Babylon does come into its prominence, that prominence won't be any more permanent than the prominence that Egypt had, no more prominent than Samaria was, no more prominent than Nineveh was. All of them will face the same destruction. And, at the same time, God will use Babylon as God's weapon. And this is another one of those themes that we've seen over and over in Isaiah. When God strikes, it is through means that historians can narrate. All right. It's not a miraculous event. It's not a, fire falling from heaven kind of event, but it is the invasion of another army. Let's keep reading here. Chapter 13, verse 6. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt, and they will be dismayed. Pangs and agony will seize them. They will be in anguish like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at one another. Their faces will be aflame. See, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the earth a desolation, and to destroy the sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pride of the arrogant and lay low the insolence of tyrants. Now, some people have, looked at, the sun will be dark at its rising, the moon will not shed its light as, a pair of eclipses that came pretty quickly. Probably not what's going on here. All right. Probably what is going on here is that Isaiah is using astronomical imagery to talk about these political realities. All right. We've seen this in other prophets. We saw it in the New Testament book of Revelation. When the lights in the heavens stop doing what the lights in the heavens are supposed to do, this is almost always a sign in these biblical prophetic writings that the order that people have come to expect is shaken up. It's upset. It is destabilized, to use a very modern bureaucratic term. And here, the destabilization, if we want to keep thinking about it in those terms, is going to be the demise of the power of Babylon. So once again, it's really fascinating because Assyria right now looks like it is the invincible land army. It looks like no one will ever be able to stop Assyria. I say land army because the Phoenicians, whose cities are Tyre and Carthage and Sidon, are the undisputed lords of the sea. But on land, you don't beat the Assyrians. Babylon, we know, because we can look back historically, did in fact take on the Assyrians and beat them. And here Isaiah is saying, even the empire that defeats the invincible empire is not itself invincible. This is what we need to, be reminded of. And Isaiah reminds us of this chapter after chapter during this part of the book, is that these great powers and the lesser powers, they are all part of God's world. All right. And so, in the 8th century BC, I mean, what looks like an unstoppable force, Babylon's going to stop them. And that's going to mean that Babylon's going to look unstoppable, but God's going to stop them too. Let's keep rolling here. Chapter 13, verse 12. I will make mortals more rare than fine gold, and humans than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger. Like a hunted gazelle or a sheep with no one to gather them, or like sheep with no one to gather them, all will turn to their own people, and all will flee to their own lands. Whoever is found will be thrust through, whoever is caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes, their houses will be plundered. Let's see here. Their wives ravished. See, I am stirring up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver and do not delight in gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men. They will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, and splendor and pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. Arabs will not pitch their tents there. Shepherds will not make their flocks lie down there. But wild animals will lie down there, and its houses will be full of howling creatures. There ostriches will live, and there goat demons will dance. Hyenas will cry in its towers, and jackals in the pleasant places. Its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged. And so once again, an entire chapter of this prophecy, and this is fascinating to me, dedicated to a power that really hasn't come into its own yet. But God wants to make known through Isaiah that when they do come into their own, they're also not going to last. All right. Some pretty gruesome imagery here. I mean, chapter 13, verse 16, their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes, their houses plundered, their wives ravished. These are images that we see in the Psalms, Psalm 137 especially, which is a psalm that comes from that moment of exile in Babylon. And, one of the things that we have to reckon with the Old Testament is that these books come from a people who, think of their enemies as their enemies. So, I mean, they don't pretend to wish well to their enemies, as so often we polite modern people do. But I mean, they talk about God breaking their teeth and God destroying their families and God burning their cities. All right. Now, I will say that, one of the calls that Jesus makes, and by the way, I mean, if you want to talk about the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of people have made a lot of the fact that when Jesus says, you have heard it was written, you shall love your friends and hate your enemies, that those words in that exact order don't occur in the Old Testament. But Isaiah 13 is pretty hateful towards enemies. Psalm 137, pretty hateful towards enemies. Amos chapters 2 and 3, pretty hateful towards enemies. All right. So Jesus, and I really hope that you hear me when I say this, he does not only take a run at the traditions, so to speak, of the scribes and the Pharisees, but in some ways he takes a run at certain passages of the Bible itself. Now, I say certain passages because the Old Testament is a collection of books. It's not a single text. And there are other passages, think the book of Ruth, think the book of Jonah, think of, trying to think of the other one, the calling of Abraham in Genesis 12. That's the third one I was trying to think of, that have a much more cosmic vision where God is God of all nations, and therefore God seeks to bless all nations. They exist right alongside the book of Nehemiah, which is very Israel-centric. Isaiah 13 here, which is very Israel-centric. But remember, Isaiah 13 also shares a scroll, if you will, with the early chapters of Isaiah in which Israel becomes a blessing to all the nations, right? So it is complicated. One of the things that I get a little bit irritated, I'll confess, when I hear people say is that the Bible is simple enough for a child to understand, yet deep enough that it will last a lifetime. Well, the second part of that's right. It is deep enough that it will last a lifetime. But if a child understands it, a very young child, I'll put it that way, what that means is they haven't read all the Bible yet. The Bible is an extraordinarily difficult collection of books. All right. There is a reason why the central organizations, the central associations, gatherings in the history of Jewish traditions and Christian traditions have always put the reading and the interpretation of these texts at their center. It's because I don't know whether to say most of us or none of us. I'm going to say none of us. None of us has what it takes to take on these books on our own. We need each other in order to read them. They're that difficult. All right. Now, some of you are going to go tell on me and say, Nathan's saying that children can't understand the Bible. Well, that's fine. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And in fact, I mean, there's one rabbinic legend. This just now comes to me that, there was a rabbi that said that no man should be allowed to read the scroll of Ezekiel until he reached 50 years old. And if you read Ezekiel, you'll know why. And incidentally, I wrote a master's thesis on Ezekiel when I was 25. So that just shows what a great fool I am. All right. Isaiah chapter 14. I'm going to end up making this video long, even though the chapters aren't that long. But chapter 14, verse 1. Actually, before I go to 14, I'm really going to make this long. The other image that I want to talk about is the wilderness. All right. This is coming from an ancient culture, which we know because it's the 8th century BC. And it's a culture in which human habitations are very few and very far between, and it's very difficult to travel between them. There are certain revolutions in human history, like the conquest of Alexander the Great, the conquest of Cyrus the Great, the conquest of Julius Caesar, the conquest of Mark Antony, in which travel between cities becomes something that could become regular. But those in the ancient world are definitely unusual moments rather than standard moments. And in fact, when the Roman Empire dissolves under the assaults of the Central European tribes, it really reverts back to what had been the norm for centuries and millennia before, when what we call early modern Europe, revolutionizes shipbuilding and revolutionizes travel and establishes permanent standing armies so that these, warlords can no longer terrorize travelers in Europe. This is not a reversion to what is normal. This is a revolution. All right. You often hear that we live in revolutionary times. We have been, at least for 700 years, give or take. All right. Now, the other thing, here's how it ties back to this, right? When God pronounces doom on these cities, one of the images that often comes is that they will become wilderness once again, because cities are extraordinarily difficult to establish. They're extraordinarily difficult to maintain. They're extraordinarily difficult to defend. And what God is saying here is, through Isaiah, of course, that, Babylon, that takes great pride in the fact that, it is starting to establish that imperial presence so that people can travel freely. It's going to be a wilderness because of its pride. All right, now for real, chapter 14, verse 1. But the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel and will set them in their own land, and aliens will join them and attach themselves to the house of Jacob. And the nations will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess the nations as male and female slaves in the Lord's land. They will take captive those who were their captors and rule over those who oppress them. And this is once again that very robust sense of dignity. The Old Testament unflinchingly insists on the dignity of Israel, right? Those who do violence to Israel, it will not stand. They will pay for it, all right? Now, that is something that is insistent, and that is something that is throughout the Old Testament. Also there throughout the Old Testament, again, it's a complex set of books, is what we see in Ezekiel once more, which is where God becomes so fed up with the injustice and the idolatry of Israel that God says, you have no dignity anymore. The only reason that I'm preserving you at this point is to preserve my own reputation. You people just aren't worth the time anymore. All right. And likewise in Hosea, where Israel becomes like the adulterous wife. She is a shame to God. Okay. And again, both of those exist side by side all the way throughout the Old Testament, so that one of the tasks that is always before us. You might wonder why we still have sermons every Sunday and why in the synagogue they still read and interpret the scriptures every Sunday. It's because they're hard. All right. Anyway, you can tell this is one of my pet peeves, right? Chapter 14, verse 3. When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor has ceased, how his insolence has ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, that struck down the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. The cypresses exult over you, the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were laid low, no one comes to cut us down. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. All of them will speak and say to you, you too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, and the sound of your harps. Maggots are the bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. Again, if you've ever heard somebody say that, if people would read the Bible more, they'd be nice. They had other books in mind than the, early parts of Isaiah, because this is just flat mean, right? And again, I mean, what's notable is that in the 8th century BC, Babylon is a regional power that everyone thinks is going to fall to the Assyrians, just like every other kingdom has. All right. And so the fact that Isaiah here is now spending 2 chapters going after this upstart is really remarkable, because Babylon, I mean, in the 3rd millennium BC, remember, I mean, most of what we have in the Bible is from the 1st millennium or 1,000 years BC. This is in the 8th century BC. But as far back as the 3rd millennium, as in 2,000 to 3,000 years before Christ, Babylon, the Paleo-Babylonians and the Sumerians were the names of the kingdoms that ruled in that region. They were uncontested. They controlled everything as far as they could before they hit the boundary of Egypt or before they hit the boundary of the Hittites. And, they kind of fell into ruins. And so, what has risen to take their place is this Assyrian Empire. And nobody expects that Babylon's going to come back. And yet, this taunt against Babylon is here. If you were with me through Revelation, no doubt you remember that this taunt against Babylon gets picked up and intensified there in Revelation, except there, of course, because this prophecy turned out to be true. There was no city of Babylon by the 1st century AD. The ruins of the Neo-Babylonians weren't discovered until the 1700s or the 1800s. I forget which century AD. So more than 1,000 years later. And so Babylon in Revelation is it's a symbol for Rome, right? Just as Babylon thought in their arrogance that they would last forever, so Rome thinks so too, but both of them are going to meet their doom. All right. Let's see here. And then we get these bizarre images, the very forests of the Fertile Crescent are going to be mocking Babylon. And then the dead are going to come out of the underworld. And remember, at this time, I mean, we don't have a divided underworld yet between the righteous and the wicked, the kind that we see in Daniel to some extent and to a greater extent in the New Testament. But they imagine the underworld as being pretty much, a single place where everyone goes. Well, in this case, all the kings are going to come out just to mock Babylon and say, what, you thought you weren't going to come down here with us? Come join us. You're going to be as weak as we are. Mean. All right. Isaiah 14, verse 12. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly on the heights of Zaphon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities, who would not let his prisoners go home? All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb. But you are cast out away from your grave like loathsome carrion, clothed with the dead, those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a corpse trampled underfoot. You will not be joined with them in burial because you have destroyed your land. You have killed your people. So once again, Babylon, it's fascinating here again. And I know I keep coming back to this, but I really need to hammer it over and over and over again. This would be something like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, making speeches against the Soviet Union. Okay. It's something that doesn't exist yet. Okay. And yet Isaiah here, through the knowledge that God has given him, through the ability to see what's coming, is speaking this word against Babylon that, of course, the people of Israel will inherit. And we see that in the Psalms. We see it in the other prophets. We see that they are ready to take their stand against Babylon. Even when Babylon has overthrown them and taken them into exile, they stand not as a kingdom with a king and walls and armies, but as a rescued people, a saved people, delivered people with the righteousness that is given to them in the law of Moses. They are ready for this to a large extent because Isaiah got them ready for this. Let's keep rolling here. Oh, no. Let's not keep rolling here. Golly. Isaiah 14 is a famous passage because in the Christian era, really starting in about the 4th century AD, people start to make verses 12 through 20 about Satan. All right. And in fact, the day star in verse 12 gets translated into Latin as Lucifer. So if you've heard that devil name before, Isaiah 14 is the root of it. And of course, Revelation, picks up some of the imagery from here. And it's fascinating because, this is pretty clearly, based on the context, a reference to the Emperor of Babylon, right? The Emperor of Babylon sets himself up to be more powerful than God. The Emperor of Babylon makes the earth tremble and shakes kingdoms and makes the world like a desert and overthrows its cities, right? And again, what is fascinating about this is that when the New Testament, to some extent, and then early Christianity even more so, is looking for a vocabulary, is looking for words and phrases and images to describe the invisible spiritual power that is the enemy that seeks to destroy all of the faithful, it is imagery from Isaiah that is applied to the king of Babylon that he reaches for, right? And again, we see this connection again in Revelation because Babylon, even though the city doesn't exist anymore, remains a powerful symbol for the powers of destruction and chaos and violence in the book of Revelation. All right. Next few verses here. I'm going to start in the middle of verse 20. May the descendants of evildoers nevermore be named. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their father. Let them never rise to possess the earth or cover the face of the world with cities. I will rise up against them, says the Lord of hosts, and will cut off from Babylon name and remnant, offspring and posterity, says the Lord. And I will make it a possession of the hedgehog and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, says the Lord of hosts. Now, if you're hearing, names of animals like ostriches and hedgehogs, and then weird phrases like goat demons, one of the reasons is that Isaiah, especially in these poetic passages, has a number of Hebrew words that don't appear anywhere else in the Bible and really don't appear anywhere else in Hebrew writing except in commentaries on Isaiah. All right. It's from those commentaries that people speculate about what those words might have meant in the 8th century BC. But if you look at 4 different translations of Isaiah 14, you're going to get just a wild list of possible translations. The technical term for this, and I always like to bring out the technical terms so you can put them in your pocket and use them to, let people know how much you know about the Bible, is hapax legomenon, or hapax for short. So if you can say hapax, that is simply a term for a word in an ancient language, in this case Hebrew, that only appears once in all of the writing that still exists in the world. Hapax. Last few verses of chapter 14 here. Starting in verse 24. The Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have designed, so it shall be, as I have planned, so it shall come to pass. I will break the Assyrian in my hand, and on my mountain trample him underfoot. His yoke shall be removed from them, and his burden from their shoulders. This is the plan that is planned concerning the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations. For the Lord of hosts has planned, and who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? So our attention now turns back to the superpower of the 8th century BC, Assyria, with its great city of Nineveh. And, once again, just in case you think that because God is going to break the power of Babylonians, that therefore the Assyrians are going to be around forever. Nah. God's going to break the Assyrians. God's going to break the Babylonians. And then what's fascinating is Isaiah's attention, and, again, because of what I believe about the Bible, I think that, God's presentation, as well as Isaiah's attention, swings to a much lesser power. Let's take a look at verse 28 here. In the year that King Ahaz died, this oracle came. Do not rejoice, all you Philistines, that the rod that struck you is broken. For from the root of the snake will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. The firstborn of the poor will graze, and the needy lie down in safety. But I will make your root die of famine, and your remnant I will kill. Wail, O gate, cry, O city. Melt in fear, O Philistia, all of you. For smoke comes out of the north, and there is no straggler in its ranks. What will one answer the messengers of the nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and the needy among his people will find refuge in her. So here at the end, we return to that vision of Zion, which is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, as the place where the poor will come, where the nations will come to receive righteousness, to learn the ways of the Lord. But before then, we get this attention on the Philistines, right? But before even that, look at verse 28. In the year that King Ahaz died, this oracle came. All right. So one of the signs that this gives us, or a reminder really, because we've been talking about it to some extent, is that Isaiah didn't stand up and talk for 32 hours straight. That's not how this book came to be. This is a collection of words from God that the disciples of Isaiah put together. We saw it several chapters earlier where he gives the command for his disciples to seal them up, right? To put them on scrolls, seal the scrolls so that the writing will be preserved. And here is an oracle that came in the year that King Ahaz died. And it is an oracle to the Philistines. They think that they have escaped because, as we'll see here in a little bit, and again, the book's not entirely in chronological order, the Assyrian threat has been driven back. But, the word that comes is, your cities, Philistines, they're not safe. Don't think that you are invincible just because this wave has not crushed your city. The wave will come that will. All right. And so, just to talk about it a little bit here, from a bird's eye view before we wrap up tonight's session. In this part of Isaiah, and it's going to go on for several chapters still, God reminds Isaiah, and Isaiah reminds us, that God's judgment is not only for the people who know the Torah. Let's put it that way. All right. Certainly there is an intensity and an intimacy of the peoples of Samaria and Jerusalem with God, because they are descended from those people that Moses brought out of Egypt, gave the teaching of God, called the Torah, and gave them this land, right? And, the intensity of God's anger against Israel, against the Samaritan kingdom, the kingdom of Samaria. Sorry, that's not the Samaritans. Those come later. The kingdom of Samaria and the kingdom of Jerusalem is really something special. But God is also ruler over all of the other nations, even the ones who think that they have overpowered the God of Israel. And the words of Isaiah here are a reminder that even the ones who are the superpowers right now, and even the ones who aren't the superpowers yet, they are all subject to the same justice that Israel is. And if they are violent and if they are unjust, they will find themselves crushed just as Israel was. Well, friends, once again, I don't know why I do this. I guess because it's the first one I'm recording tonight. I usually record 2 or 3 of these at a throw. I forgot to pray at the beginning, or maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I forget what I've forgotten. Let's have a prayer at any rate. God, we thank you for this book of Isaiah and for this vision of the world that certainly doesn't match up with much of what we see and what we hear if we only read the new stuff. God, please make us people of these prophets. Help us to see the world and shape us so that we can tell truly the story of this world and the good news that has come to this world. And it's through Christ we pray. Amen. All right, friends, that is Virtual Bible Study. Thanks for dropping in.